All right, if you have your Bibles this afternoon, I'd like for you to turn with me to Esther, chapter 4. While you're turning there, I want to ask you a question. You don't have to raise your hand or anything. It is St. Patrick's Day. Do you believe in luck? Do you believe in chance? Certain random events that just happen. No rhyme, no reason. Toss of a coin. Roll of the dice. I hate to mention that in church, but roll of the dice. Apple that falls out of a tree and lands on your head just as you're walking under it. Those things that by experience, we really have, our own experience over a lifetime, we really have difficulty explaining. And so we might intuitively believe that there is such a thing as luck or chance. But ironically, even science doesn't support that idea. And I say ironically because many in the scientific community base our entire existence on chance or luck. But science does not support the idea of random events that happen without a cause. Edward Lorenz was an MIT professor of mathematics and meteorology. And meteorology, as if you listen to the weather or look at the weather at any time, you know, it's filled with probabilities. My wife on the way over here was asking me about the weather tomorrow. I said, I don't know, I haven't checked lately. And she's looking at like 3% chance of precipitation. 3%. Now, I mean, why not 4? Why not 2? But 3% chance of precipitation. So hopefully it's going to be dry. But there's a 3% chance that it won't be. Well, Edward Lorenz was considered the father of weather and climate predictability. And when he was doing this early on, back in the 50s and early 60s, he didn't have, of course, all of the instrumentation, all of the things that meteorologists do today, the radar and all those things that he could use to try to predict the weather. He had a simple calculator, and he ran some predictive experiments trying to determine what weather would be using 12 variables like temperature and wind speed and all those things. And what he discovered was even the slightest difference in the initial causes would result in drastic differences in the outcome. He discovered that imperceptibly small variations in those initial conditions would produce widely different outcomes. And he more or less coined the term the butterfly effect, which you may have heard of. If a butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil, will it produce a tornado in Texas? I don't know. He didn't either. But his point was this. Even something as small as that would be one of the causes of a drastic weather event in some other part of the world. And his point was that there are so many factors that are involved in the events that we see around us that we can't possibly understand them all, or as human beings factor them all in, because again they're so small and so widely divergent that our minds can't comprehend it, but God's can. God's mind is that specific. He does comprehend all of those infinitesimally small variables that result in different outcomes. That's why those things like, again, very random things like the roll of the dice. Just the difference in the way a person holds their hand or the weight of the dice or whatever it might be has an effect on the outcome. Proverbs 16:33 tells us that the lot is cast into the lap. But the outcome belongs to the Lord. And the Bible teaches us that even the very smallest of random events is in God's control. And that just shows us the magnificence of God's omniscience as well as his sovereignty. R.C. Sproul was speaking writing on the sovereignty of God. He had this to say: if God is not sovereign, God is not God. If there is even one maverick molecule in the universe, one molecule running loose outside the scope of God's sovereign ordination, we cannot have the slightest confidence that any promise God has ever made about the future will come to pass. And Sproul's point is this: God is sovereign over everything. All of those things that you and I don't have the brain power to be able to comprehend, God does. Spurgeon, in his ever eloquent speech, had this to say. He said, "I believe that every particle of dust that dances in the sunbeam does not move an atom more or less than God wishes. That every particle of spray that dashes against the steamboat has its orbit, as well as the sun in the heavens. That the chaff from the hand of the winnower is steered as the stars in their courses. The creeping of an aphid over the rosebud is as much fixed as the march of the devastating pestilence. The fall of the sear leaves from a poplar is as fully ordained as the tumbling of an avalanche." And what Spurgeon was saying was, this is what I believe. I believe that all these things are in God's control. And to some, they look at that and they say, well, that's fatalistic. Where does that leave human choices? Where does that leave human freedom? But one of the things that this book of Esther teaches us is that's all a part of God's plan. That's all a part of what God does. Because just as much as he knows, again, the flapping of that butterfly wing in Brazil and what it's going to affect is going to be, he knows our choices. One thing I've learned is I don't know my own heart. Sometimes I do, but the Bible teaches us that the heart is deceitful above all members and desperately wicked. Who can know it, Jeremiah asks. But God does. God knows my heart better than I do, and so he is well aware of the choice not only that I will make, but everyone else will make at any given time. And so it's not fatalism, but rather, as we see here in this book of Esther, it's all the things that God uses to fulfill his purpose, his plan in this world. And what we see is that our choices do, in fact, matter. So as we look at this passage of Scripture here tonight, in Esther chapter 4, I want us to see that God is accomplishing his kingdom purposes in this world, and he uses us to accomplish them. So look, if you would, here at Esther. If you're not familiar with this book of Esther, just to give us a little bit of historical context, while in the Bible it follows the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, if we were to put it historically in this time frame, it'd actually be between Ezra chapter 6 and Ezra chapter 7. If you're familiar with Old Testament history, and if you've been here at King's Church, you know that Jake preached through Leviticus, and we saw the warnings that God gave to his people. As he gave them the law, he said, if you do these things, I will bless you. You will dwell in the land. You will enjoy the fat of the land. But he said, if you don't obey, the land will spew you out. You will be removed from this place that I promised to give you. And that's exactly what happened. 600 years later, we find that the nation of Israel had fully and finally turned away from God. Not every single Israelite, but at least the leadership of the country. So in 606 BC, Nebuchadnezzar and his Babylonian army came against the city of Jerusalem, and they took captive several thousand people, among them Daniel and his three friends, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. They took them to Babylon, and we read those stories in the early part of the book of Daniel. Later, he came back, 10 years later, in 597 BC, took another wave of captives back to Babylon. And then finally, in 586 BC, he came with his army, laid siege to the city of Jerusalem, and it fell to the Babylonians. They burnt the temple, destroyed the city, carried away captives, killed many. Others were left to wander throughout the nation or in other places like Egypt. And for 70 years, Israel was captive until finally the Medo-Persians overthrew the Babylonians as the great world power in 538. And when that happened, just as God had told the nation, just as God had spoken through the prophet Isaiah, Cyrus, the king of Persia, issued a decree for Jews to return back to the land of Canaan, back to their homeland, to reestablish the nation. So about 40,000 Jews returned with Zerubbabel. They rebuilt the temple there in Ezra chapters 1 through 6. And Then there's a break in that period of that story that is told in the book of Ezra for about 60 years. And it's during that 60-year period of time that the events of the book of Esther take place. Again, at that point in history, it was the Persians, the Medo-Persian Empire, who was in control of the world. Early here in this book of Esther, the writer tells us that King Ahasuerus, he's better known by his Greek name of Xerxes, but King Ahasuerus reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia, which is modern-day Sudan, North Africa. 127 provinces, one of the greatest empires, I believe the greatest empire up to that point in time. And the book of Esther begins with King Ahasuerus having a party, throwing a feast, eating, drinking, all the things that they would do at those feasts, excuse me, that the king would have. And he called for his queen, Vashti, to come before the men who were gathered there for the party, and she refused. It's one thing he did not do to the king. Now, in reading that and knowing a little bit about the history and knowing later on what happens with Esther, I'm surprised that she lived. But she did. He allowed her to live, but she was no longer queen. She was no longer his wife. And a search was made throughout the land, the 127 provinces, for someone who would take her place. And so they chose out the most beautiful, desirable women in the land, brought them before the king, and the king eventually chose a young lady named Hadassah, or Esther, as she's referred to here in the book of, in the book of Esther. Now, Esther was a Jewess. She had been born there in Persia. She had grown up there with her cousin Mordecai. And one of the things that the Bible remarks about is her great beauty. And it was because of that beauty that the king eventually chose her to be his next queen. Now, during that time, and again, if you're familiar with the story, I know I'm telling you things that you already know, but those who may not be, might help to get a little context to what we're going to see here in chapter 4. The Jews were not well liked by many people in the empire. They were considered to be people who were somewhat uncontrollable. They were thought by many people to be rebels, and were thought to be people who would not bow to the laws of the land. Now, Mordecai had actually gained some favor with the king because of a discovery that he made of a plot on the king's life. But the man who was number 2 in power there in the kingdom of Persia was a man named Haman. Haman was an Agagite. He was a descendant of the Amalekites, and there was a long-standing hatred between the Amalekites and the Israelites, and Haman was no different. Adding to that fact was, adding to that hatred was the fact that Mordecai, who was a Jew, refused to bow before Haman and respect his position. The Bible doesn't tell us why Mordecai refused to bow. Could have been simply that he felt that would be honoring a man rather than honoring God. It could have been the result of his hatred for the Amalekite people. We don't know. But he refused to do that. And as a result, Haman plotted to kill not only Mordecai, but all the Jewish people. Haman came to the king, King Ahasuerus, told him that he would give into his treasury 10,000 talents of silver if he would sign a decree that the Jews would be exterminated. Now, 10,000 talents of silver, a talent of silver, 75 pounds. 10,000 talents is 12 million ounces. Today, an ounce of silver is a little over $25. So we're talking about $300 million in today's money that Haman said, I will pay into your treasury if you will sign this decree to exterminate these people who are known to be troublesome, and we just need to be rid of them. Now, Haman was unaware of the fact that his wife was among the Jewish people. The king was. So he signed the decree into law. And one thing that the Bible reveals to us about the laws of the Medes and Persians was that it could not be changed. They cast lots. They rolled the dice to decide when this would be done. They did this, the Bible tells us, in the first month of the year, according to the Jewish calendar, which is just about this time of the year. Just after Passover, on the 13th day of the month, they cast lots to determine when the Jews would be exterminated. It worked out well for the Jews because it was going to be 11 months later, in the 12th month of the year. So they had 11 months to try to do something about this. But again, the laws of Medes and the Persians could not be changed once that had been signed by the king and sealed with his signet. And that's why what we see here in chapter 4 takes place. Verse 1 says, when Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews with fasting and weeping and lamenting. And many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. So once this decree was signed, and it began to be heralded, and again, they didn't have news media like we do today. They went from place to place, and they read the decrees in every province. When that took place, there was great mourning. Beginning here, of course, in the capital, in Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire. Mordecai was one of the first to learn of this. He clothed himself in sackcloth and ashes, which was a sign of mourning, and really somewhat dangerous for him to do. It was not allowed to be in mourning in the presence of the king. And yet there he was at the king's gate, sitting in sackcloth and ashes. Verse 4 tells us, when Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. See, she knew what that meant. She knew that if he's sitting there in sackcloth and ashes and the king saw him, he could lose his life. So she sent him some clothes. She didn't know why he was dressed like this. She just knew he was in danger. And so she sent him some clothes, but it says that he would not accept them. Verse 5 says, then Esther called for Hatach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. Hatach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. And Hatach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hatach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So Mordecai was sitting there at the gate of the palace, clothed in sackcloth. And Esther wanted to know what this was and why it was. Why are you sitting there and what's going on? She had no clue. Being inside the palace, she didn't hear the decree. The king didn't feel the need to tell her what his official business was, and so she wondered what was going on. And Mordecai gave a copy of the decree for them to read so she could know exactly what it was. And he said, you need to go. You're in a position here to be able to go to the king and to persuade him not to do this. She said, there's one law here. And that is, if anyone approaches the inner court of the king and he does not extend the golden scepter, they'll be put to death. And she said, I haven't been called to the inner court for the last 30 days. She wasn't sure at this point if she was out of favor like Vashti, his former wife, was. She didn't know what the situation was, but she was fearful for her life to go in before the king. And Mordecai again says this, don't think that just because you're in the king's palace, you'll escape this. He said, you and your father's house will also be killed. But he said, if you keep silent, he said, there will be deliverance for the Jews from another place. He didn't know where. All Mordecai was aware of was the outcome. So as Esther heard those words, she said, I will go in. You fast and you pray 3 days. We're going to fast and pray here too, and I'll go into the king. She said, if I die, I die. Take my life in my hands. I'll do this thing because I am in a position to do that. And one of the things I want us to notice here as we look at this and we think about our own situation is that even in the darkest of times, God is fulfilling his kingdom purposes. This was one of those dark times in the history of the nation of Israel. We see that throughout their history, from the very beginning, how Satan has worked to try to thwart God's plan. Now, the plan of the kingdom, as we've talked about before, and I like Von Roberts and Graham Goldsworthy, they're very helpful with this as far as understanding the storyline of the Bible, is describing God's kingdom as God's people in God's place, under his rule, and as a result, enjoying his blessing. And we see that in 2 places very clearly that is perfect in God's word. The first 2 chapters with Adam and Eve, they're in the garden. They're God's people. They're in God's place, that perfect environment he created for them. They had not yet fallen into sin, and so they were under his authority. And as a result of that, they enjoyed all his blessings. We see that again in the last 2 chapters, and I look forward to when we get there in the book of Revelation. Those last 2 chapters, in Revelation 21 and 22, we see it once again. That kingdom restored, God's people in his place, that new heaven, new earth that he's created for us, under his rule and enjoying all the blessings that he has promised to us. But the rest of the Bible, from Genesis 3 until Revelation 20, as we know, it's a mess. Genesis chapter 3 describes for us man's rebellion against God, his high-handed sin against the one command that God had given them, and plunging not only himself but his entire posterity, the human race, into sin and darkness. And so God began even then in Genesis chapter 3 to bring things back together. If you recall, that's the place where he gives the promise that it will be through the seed of the woman that the serpent's head would be crushed, a reference to Jesus giving his life on the cross. We see that from that time he began to give various promises throughout the Old Testament, revealing how he would restore all things to what they should be. And we see throughout the Old Testament, from the very beginning, again, we see Satan working through human beings to try to stop that, to try to keep it from happening. God chose a man, Abraham, chose him to be the father of many nations, God told him. He gave him 3 promises. He said, you'll be a father of a great nation. I will give you this land, and through you, all people on the earth would be blessed. And again, a reference to the Messiah who would come, the deliverer, the Savior who would come through the seed of Abraham. But even from the very beginning, Satan was working to try to keep that from happening. If we were to go back to Genesis chapter 18, we would find a visit from what appears to be Jesus Christ in his pre-incarnate appearance, along with 2 angels, to Abraham and his wife Sarah. And Jesus makes him a promise. Even though Abraham was 99 years old, his wife Sarah was 89 years old, he said, your wife's going to have a child. Sarah laughed, as I think most 89-year-olds would at that promise. She didn't believe it was true. But God said, this will happen. It did happen. We read a little bit further in Genesis chapter 22. We read about her son Isaac being born. But in between, the Bible tells a little story about Abraham and a king named Abimelech. There was trouble in the area where Abraham was living. There was a famine. Abraham and his wife Sarah went down to sojourn under King Abimelech. And Abraham said, do me this favor. He said, you're very beautiful. If anybody asks, you're my sister. You're not my wife. He was afraid he would lose his life on account of the beauty of his wife. As a result, Abimelech took Sarah into his home, into the palace. But God stopped him from violating her in any way. Had that happened, that promise God made would not have been fulfilled. But we see that God did fulfill his promise. So from the beginning, Satan was trying to overthrow this. We see it again later on, again with this nation of Israel. As they had grown to about 70 people, the Bible tells us there in the book of Genesis. We find again another famine in the land. And the people are without bread. They have to go to Egypt to find bread, to find food. And we know the story of Joseph. How God had placed him in a position of authority, placed him in a position where he would be able to feed his family, to keep them alive. And as he told his brothers, as Joseph told his brothers, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And so we see that God uses those attacks against his kingdom, against his plan, to actually fulfill his purpose. He turns that evil into good. And so we shouldn't be surprised when we see that happening to us. We shouldn't be surprised in the day and age in which we live when we see those attacks, when we see things happening that are trying to keep us from fulfilling God's kingdom purposes. Now again, his purposes today, as we know from what the Bible tells us in the New Testament, is to go and preach the gospel, is to make disciples of all nations, is to establish churches like King's Church, to be able to be a beacon and a proclamation of the glory of Jesus Christ, and to call people to himself, to fill that kingdom with people. Those attacks are still happening in the day we live, and we don't have to look very far to see that happening. And the thing that we see in this passage here as we look at the story of Esther is that as God fulfills those kingdom purposes, he uses people. He uses us. And that's the second thing I want us to notice. And that is that God has strategically placed us in a position to fulfill his kingdom purposes. Now again, we see it quite obviously here in this book of Esther. We see it quite obviously there in the story of Joseph in Egypt, going there as a slave, later as a prisoner. But rising above all that in God's providence and with his blessing to become the second most powerful man in the nation of Egypt, and being able to save not only the Egyptians, but again his own people, the Jewish people through whom the promises of God would come. We see it again very clearly here in this book of Esther. We see Esther being chosen out of who knows how many women in that kingdom, 127 provinces, and being elevated to the place of being the king's wife, of being the queen, being in a position to be able to rescue her people from this destruction. And so we see that God strategically places people in a position to fulfill his purposes. And that's no less true of them than it is of you and me. Have you ever thought or ever wondered what it would be like to be born at a different time or in a different place, a different era, maybe in the Old West, I don't know. I watch some of those movies and I think, no, that's, come back to reality. I'm pretty well off where I am, I have a bathroom inside my house. But there's still those romantic ideas about being born in a different time, different place. And some might think of the past, some might think of the future. The point is, we're alive now by God's plan and his purpose. and for a reason. You and I have been born into this world, and we were born into this world to serve a purpose. There in one of Paul's sermons in the book of Acts, referencing David, he says David served his generation, and he died. You and I have a generation to serve. Now, some of my generation is gone, but many of us are still here. But the generation would be the period of time that I'm here alive on this earth. I have a purpose to serve. And you and I are alive now to fulfill God's purpose, His kingdom purpose for this age. As Mordecai told Esther, for such a time as this. We've been given unique gifts and opportunities and spheres of influence to be used for God's kingdom, to bring others into the kingdom, to live in such a way that God has brought glory. So it's no accident that you and I are here together. I was thinking about this as we've been endeavoring to plant King's Church over these past several months. Been thinking about the circumstances that brought us to this point. And I told someone several months ago when we were talking about this, about planting a church. I shared with them, I said, I don't like to make things too personal. But one of the things I've learned in my life is that whatever situation God brings me into, sometimes as a result of my decisions, sometimes just things that happen, I know God has a purpose in that. Many of you are a little bit familiar with my wife and I, our history. We were missionaries for 30 years, most of that time in Cambodia. But the first mission field we went to was the country of Sri Lanka. And one of the things God did while we were there was to teach us a lot of things. I think you probably agree, first you're on the field, you learn a lot. You learn mostly what you don't know. But we went to Sri Lanka in 1989. We had an 8-month-old son, our oldest boy, and she was pregnant with our second child, 6 months pregnant. And we got to the country, and they were in the midst of a civil war, fighting on two different sides. There were three factions that were fighting for the control of the country. We lived on a ridge up above the city of Kandy, which is the second largest city in the country, right in the middle of the country. We lived on a ridge up above the Mahabeli River. And at night we would go to bed and we could hear the automatic weapon fire up and down the river valley. In the mornings you'd wake up and you would see the bodies floating in the river, usually headless. It was a frightening time, to be honest with you. We were there for a year. At the end of that year, we had to leave. Not because of the violence, although I'll have to admit, I was not sad about leaving at that point in time. It wasn't because of the violence, it's because the group that had sponsored us in would not renew our visa to be able to stay without us having to compromise a lot of things that we couldn't compromise. So we left after a year. I came back to the States while we waited for something to open up. We mentioned we went to Singapore, but during that time, those several months that we were back here in the States, I went to a meeting of pastors. And I remember very clearly, it was up in Marion, Ohio. And pastor there introduced me to the other pastors, and he said that they spent a year in Sri Lanka, but he said, I guess God made a mistake. And he said, no, wait, God doesn't make mistakes. He said this publicly. He said, I guess you made a mistake. And to be honest with you, I wanted the same thing. That's what I'd been thinking. Did we make a mistake? Were we not to go there at all since we only stayed for a year? Did not win anyone to Jesus Christ that I'm aware of during the time we were there. And I began to look at that and examine it. And what I saw was that God accomplished many things, like I said, not the least of which was what He did in us. The experience that we gained, things that we learned during that period of time. But we also worked with a national pastor there. We helped to encourage him in his work. We helped him to be able to continue. And so I realized that God had us there, even though just for a short time. And He was accomplishing His purpose through us. So as I said, that was one of the things I learned while we were there. And one of the things that I've looked at since that time is that wherever God has us, He has a purpose for us. Now, many of us are here today, and we've come out of some difficult circumstances over the last few months. Again, I began to ask myself, why? Why did this happen? Why am I here at this point in time? And the conclusion I've come to is that for such a time as this, is to establish King's Church. It's for us to plant this work, for us to bring glory to Him and to do the work that He's called us to do, that He has strategically placed us here together to fulfill His purposes. And the last thing I want us to think about as we consider this is that you and I, because of that, we can boldly take risks, knowing that God's in control. We see that with Esther. Excuse me. We see that with Esther. Esther knew very well what could happen when she went to the king. She knew that she was in danger of losing her life if he did not hold out the golden scepter. But she said, I will. I'll go into the king, and if I perish, I perish. She had placed her life in God's hands, which is where all of our lives are anyway. She had realized that she could take this risk in order to save her people. And I use that word risk because, again, I'm thinking of it from the human perspective. I'm thinking of it from our side of things. We think of something like that as a risk. We think of going to Sri Lanka in the midst of a civil war as a risk. We might think of planting a church as a risk of some sort. But we need to define risk carefully. A risk is only a risk if there's a possibility of you losing more than you venture. It's not a risk if we know that whatever we lose, we gain a greater reward. And that's always true of God. Esther said, I'll go into the king, and if I perish, I perish. If she had perished, she would not lose any more than she would gain as a reward. God is not going to be indebted to anyone. He will always give us more than we offer to Him. And so there's never a possibility of us losing in this risk, if we want to call it that. The only possibility of loss is if we don't risk. Remember the parable that Jesus told of the master who went into a far country, entrusted to his servants various talents, and again the same unit of measure of weight, 75 pounds. Doesn't tell us what the talents were, but he gave to one 10 talents, gave to another man 5 talents, to another 1 talent. Man with 10 talents went out and he risked it. He invested it. He used it for his master. When his master returned, he said, I've got 10 more. Same thing with the man who had 5. He gained more. But the one who had been given 1 said, I knew you were a hard master. I knew that, you would not be happy if I lost this 1 talent. So I didn't do anything with it. I didn't risk it. And the master said, you've answered correctly. And he took it away from him. The only possibility we have of losing in this venture, if we want to refer to it in that way, is if we don't risk anything. Now, is there risk in planting a church? On a human level, we might consider that. I think the Toby's risking more than any of us because his livelihood is wrapped up in this. Some of us risk perhaps some finance. Some of us risk some time, energy, all those things. But it's never going to be more than God gives us back in reward. God will not be indebted to anybody. He will not be indebted to you and I if we risk these things. I, as I've said before, enjoy reading biographies. And having been a missionary, particularly missionary biographies, they have encouraged me many times. And one of the biographies that, quite honestly, I haven't read the whole thing. I've read bits and pieces of it. It's quite a volume. Is the life story of a missionary named John G. Patton. John Patton was a missionary in the mid-1800s to the New Hebrides Islands, which is in the South Pacific Ocean. It was a group of islands that was inhabited by some very fierce people, cannibals. Some other missionaries had attempted to evangelize those islands 20 years earlier and had been eaten by cannibals. So it was quite a risk for he and his young wife to set sail to try to take the gospel to the New Hebrides Islands. And in fact, one of the elders of one of the churches there in England before he left said this and said, "You can't go, you'll be eaten by cannibals." And Patton responded like this. He said, "Mr. Dixon, you're advanced in years now, and your own prospect is soon to be laid in the grave, there to be eaten by worms. I confess to you that if I can but live and die serving and honoring the Lord Jesus, it will make no difference to me whether I'm eaten by cannibals or by worms." Kind of a bold statement for a young man, but you have to admire what he had to say. He said, "We're all going to die. We don't know when, we don't know how. But he said, if I can live my life to honor Jesus Christ and bring glory to him, I don't care if I'm eaten by worms or if these cannibals are going to eat me. I'm going to step out. I'm going to do this." He was willing to take that risk, knowing that whatever took place, and he suffered some tremendous loss, lost a child within the first year they were there, lost his wife after a few years, lived there for over 40 years, but his legacy lives on today because of the churches that were established during that time. Because he knew this. It's a risk, but it's never going to be a loss. A loss sometimes in this life, yeah, we might experience some, but never when it's counted in the light of eternity. So as we look at what God has for us, we look at serving God's purposes here in this world, in our age, we can take those risks. Now, if you're here this afternoon and you don't know Jesus Christ, I would say to you, it's no accident that you're here with us. It's not a mistake that you have come to worship with us this afternoon. We've talked about taking risks. We've talked about sacrifice. But no sacrifice was ever greater than the sacrifice that Jesus Christ made on the cross when he died for our sins. A few weeks, just a couple of weeks, we'll be celebrating Easter. The time of year when we remember his sacrifice for us and his glorious resurrection from the dead that guarantees all of those promises God had made, just as we've been talking about in Revelation. All those promises God has made will be fulfilled. And so as we're here today, if you're here and you don't know Jesus Christ, it's not by accident that you're here. He's calling. The invitation is open. And again, as we see here in this book of Esther, our choices do make a difference. We can answer that call or we can refuse it. It will not stop God's kingdom purpose. Those of us who are here and we know Jesus Christ, and some of us are committed. We have become core members of this group to help establish this church. Others have been gathering together with us for some time. We welcome each one. But God has a purpose for us. If we'll step out and we'll be willing to risk whatever God has entrusted to us. Let's go to him in prayer tonight.